Explain the linkage between rising consumer prices and an increase in migrants entering the U.S.
Sure thing, Scarlet. Uh, what the authorities in both the US and Mexico are on the watch for is that in the past, you've had in recent years the push factors of the pandemic, the global health emergency, as well as the underlying poverty and the violence that is rampant in the northern triangle of Central America that have been big catalysts for people migrating to the US. And now, additionally, you have in Honduras and in El Salvador the highest cost of living increases in years. And so this is something that people are grappling with. They are already facing food pressures from drought and from hurricanes, from natural disasters. All of those prices are increasing faster, as well as energy, gasoline, oil to heat homes, and for cooking. And so this is something that that is really a factor that we haven't dealt with in the same way in a number of years.
Let me ask an obvious question, because you point out that prices are rising in many of these countries. Certainly, prices are also rising in the U.S., and the U.S. is more expensive than Central and Latin America. Wouldn't people be leaving a land of high prices only to enter a land of even higher prices?
On the one hand, that is absolutely true. But on the other hand, the historic attraction of the U.S. is the ability to earn salaries and earn wages that are many multiples of what people could earn back home in Central America. And so even though you would have a higher cost of living here, the tight U.S. job market and the great demand for labor that we've seen and the growth of the U.S. economy coming out of the pandemic are all powerful pull factors attracting people, and they have historically attracted people to migrate to the U.S. despite the higher cost of living.
Fair enough. Now, you mentioned these historical patterns a couple of times. We know migration from Central America to the U.S. follows a seasonal pattern. Typically, people go north in the spring and warmer months. Has that still been the case since the pandemic began, or did COVID completely disrupt that and change that pattern?
COVID disrupted that for a time in the first months of the pandemic in North America and in the Americas in, say, March, April of 2020. We saw relatively low and historically low numbers for recent years of people migrating, but that really picked back up last year. We saw more than 200,000 people actually last July. July is a month when you would typically expect to see a decrease because of the extreme heat. But the July and August both saw more than 200,000 people apprehended at the border or encountered at the border by Customs and Border Protection. That was the most in 20 years. And so we've really seen that although there has been a historic seasonality to this, in recent years that has been upended by the pandemic and by the desperation in some of these countries.
Yeah. When the migrants go north, is it just for those seasonal jobs, or do they tend to stay on in the U.S. Even during the cold winter months?
No, the majority of people who are going north tend to remain in the U.S. Actually, the seasonal migration, there's only a few tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands of H-2B visas that are available for that kind of work. But those are relatively few in number. Yeah. And actually, the strengthening of the protection of the border has been something that has incentivized people to stay once they reach the U.S. more than they did in the past. Because if people are coming undocumented, it may be harder to get in the future, and they're already paying tens of thousands of dollars to smugglers often to help them make the journey. And just the hardening of the border has reduced the seasonal migration by people who are doing it undocumented rather than through legal visas.
Right. Okay. So in the interest of our conversation, I guess we'll keep it to undocumented migration here. We mentioned earlier that U.S. Officials, along with their counterparts in these Central American countries, like Mexico, for instance, are holding discussions on this. What kind of discussions are these? How high up the ladder does it go? And what are some of the specific measures, policy measures being discussed?
Well, we saw earlier this week that the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, was in Mexico City and in Costa Rica, dealing with those governments. We've also seen on the development side of things a trip last summer by Vice President Kamala Harris to Mexico City and to Central America to meet with the leaders and to really underline the shared desire for development. That's been a big priority for this Mexican administration is development in Central America, programs that reward people for things like planting trees and cultivating land, or programs to support people with direct cash transfers. And we've seen a big focus by the Biden administration as well on both development and relief. We saw an extra $300 million, largely in relief to mitigate the effects of drought last year for Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador announced. And there's also, of course, the aspect of border protection.
Yes.
And we've seen in Mexico the National Guard that has been used for border security. And we've seen in the US during the pandemic much quicker returns of people who arrive in the US, much quicker expulsion of people arriving in the US, initially for health reasons, but that's something that has continued even as vaccines have become available.
Okay, so that's where I want to go next, because US border officials have been using something called Title 42 to quickly expel migrants at the southern border. Tell us more about this policy and why it's proving to be so controversial for the Biden White House.
Sure. Title 42 was implemented by the Trump administration in March of 2020 as a way to try to keep people from being housed too long in detention centers where it was feared that COVID would spread more easily. And so the idea is that people were quickly expelled. They didn't have the same weight and process and procedures that they had pre-pandemic. But many thousands of them were expelled deported to Mexico. And this has created a situation of a humanitarian pressure and even crisis on the border in cities in northern Mexico, just by the mass of people who have been living there, often in squalid conditions, and also vulnerable to organized crime.
Yeah, many of whom are not Mexican, by the way. They came from other countries, right?
Exactly. Many from Central America, or even from Haiti or Africa or Venezuela or Brazil, from many other countries. And so this is something the Mexican government has been unhappy about the extra burden that has placed on Mexico, as well as human rights activists who say that this is not the way that the U.S. should be treating asylum seekers. And so we've seen pressure building as the world has started to, and as the U.S. has started to normalize in going into the third year of this pandemic, pressure to end Title 42, but also Mexican authorities pressuring and urging the U.S. to return and repatriate more migrants who are expelled directly to their home countries rather than to Mexico, just saying that the situation of people waiting at Mexico's northern border is unsustainable.
Yeah. This is going to involve a lot more than just U.S. and Mexican officials. Eric, very quickly here, you are a U.S. economy reporter based in Washington. You cover the IMF, the World Bank, the U.S.'s relationship with Latin America. You worked at Bloomberg's Mexico City Bureau for a number of years. You also covered emerging markets. Based on where you sit and with your knowledge of the region, what do you see happening next year?
Well, this is something that authorities are prepared for in the U.S., the surge in migration going into the spring months. But this also creates a political conundrum for President Joe Biden in that, if migration and undocumented immigrants become a big focal point ahead of the midterm elections in November, I think many political analysts see that as an area of risk for Biden, and so that creates a complicated panorama for him as the Democrats seek to maintain their working majority in the Senate and their majority in the House.